Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Diverse Talk Matters. To talk about different things around diversity, equity, inclusion, talk about things that people may find challenges with, so we hope you find them really useful. Some are around people's different lived experiences, some really challenging conversation, things that sometimes we don't need to talk about. But we really hope you enjoy the range of topics that we are introducing to you or bringing to you, to your homes, to your house, to your workplaces. We hope you enjoy.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Diverse Matters podcast. So today we're going to be discussing all things ADHD with three wonderful guests who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves separately. So we'll go down the line. We'll start with Lex, then we'll go to Adam, and then we'll go to Daniel. Lex, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks, Michaela. Hello, I am Lex Caragorgius. My pronouns are he, him. I am a consultant with Diverse Matters, and I was diagnosed with ADHD 2 years ago. 2 years ago, yes. Really excited to be here.
Thank you, Lex. And Adam?
Hello, everybody. Hello, Michaela. My name is Adam Nelm. I am 54 years old. I am a client services officer with Diverse Matters. I've worked for Diverse Matters nearly 2 years now. And I was first diagnosed with ADHD in 2016.
Okay, thank you so much, Adam. And Daniel?
Hello, everybody. My name's Daniel Ahern. I'm the founder of an organisation called Adjust, which aims to promote neurodiversity in workplaces. And I'm the author of a book called The Pocket Guide to Neurodiversity. And I was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult a couple of years ago as well.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to kick us right off. Can you tell us your with your diagnosis?
I, like a lot of people, I started thinking that I might have a squiggly brain, where I think it was roughly at the beginning of lockdown when I really started to seriously consider, I might have ADHD. And it was something that was never picked up at school. I didn't display what people probably thought were the classic ADHD traits. I wasn't bouncing around classrooms or anything. It was early 2020 that I started seeing videos from educators and content creators talking about signs you might have ADHD. And at that point, I started considering it, put myself forward for an official diagnosis, and got diagnosed just in time for me to move to Finland, which complicated things somewhat. I currently live in Finland. I was diagnosed first in the UK, and I moved here before I was able to be put on any kind of medication or anything. So in my naivety, I took my diagnosis to my doctor here and was quite quickly told, oh no, you're just anxious. You just have anxiety. This isn't a real diagnosis. This isn't a valid diagnosis. Yeah. And fast forward a year, I think it took me a year to finally get put on medication. I had to go privately to get re-diagnosed by a Finnish psychiatrist. And yeah, now we're all good. Now it's all okay. That process is really challenging.
I'm curious about the disconnect with the UK and Finland diagnosis, and what was the reasoning behind them not accepting your UK diagnosis?
I guess the short answer is that Finland is, in terms of the medical community, the culture of medicine here is very averse to prescribing stimulant medication. Very, very averse. It's really strongly regulated. I found out later that if I had gone to a psychiatrist and he had prescribed me medication without re-diagnosing me, he could have had his license revoked.
Thank you for sharing, Lex. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. Adam, I'm going to come to you next.
Okay, so my journey to diagnosis, all the way through childhood, I was regarded as a bit of a daydreamer. And through school, I was regarded as somebody who made quite a few mistakes in his sort of written work. But once, if I really applied myself, I could submit good quality work. And that followed me into my working life. It first really got into my mind because one of my jobs, I worked on the sort of fringes of special educational needs. And so I was looking at a lot of literature. And my first sort of belief was that I was maybe mildly dyslexic. Although I was within a team, my duties were quite specific to me. So there was really no hiding place. And we started to explore why my work was suffering. And my employer then paid for a test for dyslexia. And then a diagnosis came out of this dyslexia test. I wasn't dyslexic, but I had a mild ADHD, and I was on medication shortly after that. the mental health team in cars is being actually very good. And in fact, as a side plot, I'm actually off my meds at the moment because my blood pressure started to spike. And of course, virtually every single ADHD medication you take are stimulants. So they're exploring some workarounds to get me back on some form of ADHD medication. So if you see me wandering off, if you see my eyes wandering during the podcast, you'll know why.
I'm really excited to hear some more about your journey. Daniel, love to hear about your journey to diagnosis next, please.
I'm really interested in why Lex moved to Finland. I've worked with a lot of different groups, and often people said, oh, in Finland, there's less small talk and there's like a lot of the unwritten rules are a lot more obvious and stuff like that. So I wondered what attracted you to Finland.
I moved here because my partner lived here. So yeah, when you speak to people who have moved here, it's either they met somebody who was Finnish and lived here, or they've moved here for work.
Yeah, it's interesting just because I've done a lot of training over the years, and a lot of autistic people I know have been really fascinated by, say, Japanese culture, or Finland's another place that comes up as well. So must be, I just wonder if there's something about the neurodivergent cultures of those places. But I'll answer your question now. Going off on a tangent. Tangents is ADHD. I got diagnosed with ADHD officially when I was trying to write my book. So I did a presentation. I do a lot of training on neurodiversity. I did a presentation one day to publishers. And as a lot of us, perhaps that are neurodivergent, like I don't have an ulterior motive. So some of my friends afterwards were like, well, it's obvious you were watching a book. And I was like, not to me, it wasn't. I was just doing a training session. And then 2 weeks later, I got an email saying, we think your training session will be a great book. So I signed the contract and everything. And then a year later, I still hadn't written it. And I'd run out of excuses. So about a year in to that process. And I think it's an interesting point. Like for the first time in my life, even though I've worked in this field all my life, I had to ask for help, which is quite hard, even though that's what I've been recommending to people my whole life. And anyway, that led to a diagnosis. I went privately as well, which I was lucky enough to be able to afford, but it's not there for everybody. But self-identification is very, very valid. And then, that really helped me. I don't take medication at the moment. I talk about on my training, the cactus in the desert is an exactly right environment for that cactus. And if you move that cactus to my back garden in London, nothing about the environment supports that cactus. And what I try to be is the cactus in the desert. So at school, I would have been in trouble all the time for talking, moving around a lot, just getting overexcited, stuff like that. And actually, as a trainer, that's all you want. You want your trainer to talk a lot, be passionate. And it's all right if you move around as a trainer. But I found the pandemic very hard because all my training suddenly went virtual. I'd never have set up a virtual training company ever. So that was also behind the diagnosis. But interestingly, like Adam, at school, I was referred in year 9 to a dyslexia assessment. I didn't have dyslexia, but I was described throughout my whole life as like slapdash and not caring, which in a way is like ironic because I do super care. But because I not worry about like how my work was written. And sometimes at school you might get 5% for punctuation and spelling. I don't care about that 5%. I'll just do a really good essay. I won't worry about that. And I think it might depend on age as well. Like I'm 40 now. So like when I was at school, ADHD, autism, dyspraxia wasn't talked about. Anyone that had any difficulty with that environment, you'd have been sent down the dyslexia route. And I find that quite interesting as well. Now people I meet that have got a diagnosis of dyslexia over the age of perhaps 35, I'm like, it would not surprise me if they had another undiagnosed neurotype as well. So that's my sort of journey. That was the tip of the iceberg, really, the struggles of the pandemic and trying to write a book that finally tipped me over the edge. Like I suppose like all of us, there's the whole thing under the tip of the iceberg as well. I think like anybody in my friends and family has always known, like been joked about since I was a teenager. So it was like an open secret, if you like. I think for me, it was just not being able to get the book over the line. And then once you get the diagnosis, I don't know how Adam and Lex feel, but then I was just a lot more accepting of myself. Even though I've worked in this field all my life, I was like, you know what? Certain things don't work for me in certain ways. And the publishers were amazing. Yeah, it's always been an open secret amongst anyone that knows me well. If you meet me for an hour in certain environments, you might be like, this man's not got ADHD, but know me over a week, you wouldn't know.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, so that's what I want to move on to next in terms of people working with you and in your employment history and like how has your ADHD impacted your employment? What did employers do well and what do you wish that they would have done better? I'll come back to you, Lex.
Yeah, thank you, Michaela. My brain is currently going 100 miles an hour because there were so many things that you said, Daniel, that I was just like, yes, I relate to that so hard. Yeah, so apologies if my sentence goes a bit all over the place. Just ADHD things. When I think about my working environment before I was diagnosed with ADHD formally, I did have really good, really supportive manager, and that made a whole load of difference. Because in that environment, I didn't necessarily need a diagnosis. I didn't even suspect I had ADHD actually at the point, because anything I needed, my manager supported me. So we had regular one-to-ones. She helped me to break up tasks into smaller pieces. She helped me to set priorities, which was, with hindsight, it all makes sense that would be really beneficial for me. But then when I really struggled was when I then went to do my master's. When you were talking about writing your book, Daniel, I just couldn't help but think about my experience of writing my master's dissertation and what an ordeal that was and how I became really unwell. I started working on it early to try to get ahead of it. I knew that I would need more support. I knew that I would need more time. And then I didn't get the support I needed. And despite starting early, I still graduated later than my peers because I just became so unwell. It was such a huge project. As I think many of us can relate to on the call or on this podcast, big projects are a nightmare. Trying to split everything up, trying to break it down into smaller pieces, making it feel less overwhelming. I did not have that kind of supervision when I was doing my master's, and that really made things difficult. Having the diagnosis has helped. It's helped me understand myself. It's helped me to make sense of how I process things and how I work and how I communicate. But I was still an ADHD before I had the diagnosis. It's just meant that I have almost more weight. When I ask for reasonable adjustments, I can say I have ADHD. It shouldn't be that way. It is. So yeah, I can think of one particularly bad example. One of my previous employers, my line manager would just send me really long emails with a subject line that didn't really make that much sense, that didn't indicate what the email was about. There was no formatting. There was not really any paragraphs. And I would just attempt to read it and just, I don't know what you're asking me. I don't know what to do with this. That was really challenging. And not knowing what my priorities were, and everything was a priority. So really nothing was a priority. That was a real challenge. But yeah, and when managers have done things well and when colleagues have done things well, really helping and supporting with just clarifying, what do you need from me? When do you need it by? What are the priorities? Can we split this up into smaller tasks? Can we have different deadlines for each part of the task if it's a big one? In terms of software, I promise I'm not sponsored by them, but I have been using Claro Read and it is fantastic. I was lucky enough to get Claro Read given to me by DSA when I was a student. It's basically a screen overlay, and it has an underline capability so that if I'm reading long documents, my eyes don't jump around the page. I can just focus in on the one line or two lines that I'm reading, and it has been a game changer. So that's been really fantastic for me. Yeah, also plugging things into text to speech programs to just read things out, so that if I'm writing an important email or an important document and I just don't have the brain capacity to read through it, I can just plug it in, it reads it out, I can spot mistakes.
That's fantastic, Lex. And for me, I'm really curious. With this podcast, we want to make sure that we're adding value. Right? We want to make sure that folks can hear this podcast and take it in. These are the practical things that I can do. And so when we're talking about specific things that your employer and your colleagues helped you with in terms of clarity, did they initiate the conversation, or was that more on you to initiate the conversation? And how was that process? Again, thinking about reasonable adjustments, how can we make the space easier for you to be able to thrive?
That's a really difficult question, because it feels like every other day I have a conversation about the fact that reasonable adjustments need to be proactive as much as possible, but there also needs to be space to work with the person so that you're not just applying a one size fits all. Oh, you're disabled, you need a screen reader. I might not. I guess in terms of practical advice, the best thing I can say is to just be proactive. It doesn't matter if the person has disclosed that I'm disabled or if they've not disclosed that they're disabled. Adjustments help everybody. Somebody might not be neurodivergent, might not be disabled, and might still benefit from flexible working hours. They might be a parent, for example. Yeah, in terms of who has initiated those conversations, in my case, a lot of the times that I initiated those asks, I was often not given the support that I needed, because there wasn't that mentality that this is something that we proactively need to do. That's not to say that if I were to initiate that conversation with someone else, I wouldn't get that support. It's just in my experience, that's how things have worked out. When I have gotten the support I need, it has tended to come from either my manager or my employer or policy within the organization. And there has been that consistent checking in with me. How are you doing? Can I do anything? And yeah, just keeping up the dialogue has made a huge difference. Yeah, and made me actually happy to come to work, which is what we want, right?
Awesome. Thank you, Lex. Adam, I remember when we had our pre-chat, you spoke quite fondly about previous employees with some of the support. I'm reading to hear what you have to say on this topic as well.
In the positives, yeah, the journey towards a diagnosis was the sort of high point, really. And that was my previous employer, my boss, with whom I'd worked as a non-sort of manager to managed relationship. So we were friends as well. So we were able to really explore what was going wrong. And she actually gave me space to explain the sort of things like word blindness, zoning out, hyperfocus, all of those things, which at the time I thought were maybe dyslexia. But she said, well, yeah, let's do the test. And then we were able to get some adjustments in place. I was in an open plan office for some of the time, but for afternoons, I worked on my own, and because that was for certain tasks, that was better. I was just given loads and loads of notebooks to write, and it wouldn't be a problem if I wrote in some tasks in one notebook and some tasks in another. Yeah, that was a high point. I think a low points, I don't know really. It's difficult because I worked, one of my first full-time jobs was with Cardiff County Council, and it was, at the time it was massively dysfunctional, massively factional, real problems. I think the fact was that people who probably weren't up to the task, there were lots of people who weren't up to the task but were still able to kind of function. And I sat within that, and it was very results driven. And my sort of approach was make sure you just get the results, just get the jobs done that you need to get done. One of the more fortunate things was there was flexi time. So, and that suited me great. Again, it's working on my own, and I could really focus on tasks. So I was getting the big tasks finished off and racking up flexi time leave as well. But there wasn't really an attempt where my performance was falling off. There wasn't really much of an attempt to explore why that was. That was sort of low point there, insofar as there was no effort really. And I think probably we're talking, I was with Cardiff 1997 to 2005. And possibly, I don't know where the sort of overall journey was with ADHD and how it was being identified. But there wasn't really much of an effort to sit down and say, why do you think these errors are happening?
And the point that there are some policies that for everyone that weren't necessarily targeted at you. It's like, oh, okay, this is what you need to do, but here's this open for everyone with the flexible work. Isn't very similar to what Lex was saying. If it's available to all, then everyone's going to just benefit from it. Thank you so much, Adam. Daniel, I'm going to come to you now because you work for yourself, right? How do you feel that ADHD has impacted your entrepreneurial journey? What do folks need to know when they work with you?
I think it was really interesting what Adam was saying about how when a workplace is dysfunctional, neurodivergent people can struggle. Because I think when a workplace is dysfunctional, neurodivergent people struggling is like a beacon that actually this whole system is broken in this workplace. And I've seen neurodivergent people flourish in workplaces are running well. So I find that quite interesting. We're like little beacons of there's something wrong here. I think even from my entrepreneurial journey, I got learnings from my career as well. So when I started at the charity, when I was younger, and I still do it today, I was told I wear my heart on my sleeve. I'm very mouthy. I'll tell you what I think and stuff like that. And I remember early on in my career, knowing when I was younger, I had to go into a role that involved movement and talking. And I went into the role and I was a support worker with autistic people who had learning disability as well. So there was a lot about accessing the community, and I was good at the job. I loved my job. But the charity I worked for had this ridiculous process where only 1% of people could get outstanding for that year. So I said to my line manager, this is a ridiculous process. Next thing I know, I get brought into a secret disciplinary meeting So I was told it was going to be a team meeting, but it was actually the area manager and my manager talking to me about my attitude, because the line manager complained that I said she was ridiculous, but I said the system was ridiculous. The meeting was jumped on me. I was young then, 22, 23, and now I wouldn't have that. I'd be like, this is disgraceful. I'd get up and walk like, let's do this properly. But I learned what doesn't work sometimes is, that manager there and that way didn't really support me. And then I went to another team within that organization, and I had an amazing manager who I actually thank in my book, David Perkins, because he created a culture in that team of allowing people to play to their strengths. It was never sat down with me and said, you're better at this, you're not so good at that, do this. The culture of the team, like water finding its way to the ocean, we all found our way. And I actually found that's when I was good at training. So all of that led to me eventually setting up my own organization. And a lot of neurodivergent people do, because, I find it very difficult to cope with being told what to do. I think my way is the best way, and I like to work flexibly. So that suits me. But really interestingly, what I struggled with as my business got busier was organization. Queen of Diverse Matters kept recommending to me an assistant called Stavrula. And I was like, oh, I don't know. And then one day I double booked a training session, and you can't do that if you're running your own business. And then eventually, I do need some help in this area. And Stavrula has been amazing. So if you've got ADHD, having an assistant in your life is useful. I pay for it through my business. You can also get support for access to work. My top tip around it is know what you're not good at and be very clear with your assistant about what you need help with. And now Stavrula helps my business tick along, and I can turn up and talk like this, like training. So all of that journey goes together. But the top thing that's helped me now is having that assistant with my diary management, my time planning, and booking things in forms. I can't fill in forms. So that's really interesting.
Daniel, you've brought us on very nicely to the next question. What advice would you offer people living with ADHD and people working with people who have ADHD?
I think what's really interesting when I gave that example, when I said this system's ridiculous, that one manager said I thought I was calling her ridiculous, and I got into a secret disciplinary meeting. With my next manager I met, David Perkins, I would talk to him about stuff in the week, and he'd be like, yeah, I agree with you. And it would really just talk that zing out of my anger. And he'd be like, but these are the systems we've got to work in. Let's work to the best of our ability instead of taking it personally. So I think if you work with people with ADHD, we will ask why a lot. We will question things. But sometimes, I suppose, to other people out there, don't take it personally about you. Like, it's just how we are. We'll ask why, we'll question stuff. So that's something that I found useful with people that could understand me. Understand that perhaps we might need to work in 3 or 4 environments in a day. And if I'm not at my desk working in your eye line, I am working, I will find somewhere in a building to go and work. I'll need 3 or 4 of them, different places. And I suppose I just need that acceptance around that movement and stuff like that.
Thank you, Daniel. And any advice for folks maybe at the early stage of their ADHD diagnosis, or maybe suspect it within themselves?
I think learn about it and learn about the positives and the challenges, but definitely learn about the positive. I think we need to balance it. I don't like the narrative superpower, but I like the idea of the balancing between the challenges. If you Google ADHD, it'll just be loads of negatives. But we need to learn about our strengths. And I honestly believe that the more we play to our strengths, people with ADHD, the more successful we'll be. And making sure we can get some support in those areas where actually we can't get around having to plan some things in the diary. So playing to your strengths as much as possible. That's what I would suggest. And learning about it, looking at some of the great books that are out there now, podcasts, and people on LinkedIn and stuff like that are great activists. People like Ellie Middleton on LinkedIn, Leanne Maskell on LinkedIn.
Thank you, Daniel. Adam, I see that you're taking some notes there as well, which is great and which is exactly what we want. But what advice would you give people living with ADHD and folks working with people who have ADHD?
There's a lot of things I would have said that, just to back up what Daniel said. I think the key thing with me, and it cuts across both an ADHD person and working with ADHD, is try not to get angry, because I get terribly angry with myself if something's gone wrong. And I suppose to echo that advice to colleagues, because please try not to get angry with ADHD people, because they'll be angry with themselves. I almost guarantee it. And also, play to your strengths. I think hyperfocus, for example, is a real strength when you're doing certain things, because then that can cut across the sort of task finishing aspects, which can be an ADHD weakness. And don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to talk about and own it a little bit. And celebrate it. One of the first things I did on diagnosis is I did a Google search for famous people with ADHD, just as a sort of reassurance that, you can be successful. Daniel has his own business. Lex is a successful consultant. I've been fairly successful in my career, probably more successful than I would have been had I not been diagnosed. So be proud of it a little bit. Do celebrate it, and don't beat yourself up.
Appreciate it, Adam. Thank you. And now Lex, I'd love to hear what advice you have for folks.
Oh, where do I start? So I guess to other ADHDers, whether you're diagnosed or not, you don't need a diagnosis to be valid and for your needs to be valid. As I mentioned before, a diagnosis helps. It does help to give weight to reasonable adjustments in the workplace, even if it shouldn't. But self-diagnosis is valid, especially considering how inaccessible it is to get a diagnosis. And also, this touching on what Adam was saying, but internalized ableism is so difficult to unlearn and takes a really long time. So I guess the biggest thing that I would say is that there's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. And that's something that I think once I got the diagnosis, I started to also understand about myself. There's nothing wrong with me. I just process things differently. I just need to work in different environments. And quite often it's the environment that's the problem. So don't be afraid to ask for what you need. And if you're not in an environment where you can ask for what you need, I guess I just want to give reassurance that there are environments like that out there. It's taken me a while to find a working environment and a working pattern that works for me. I personally did try to be a full-time freelancer, and I could not do it. I need a level of structure. Otherwise, I just can't do anything. It's almost like I get this kind of paralysis. But now I've got a setup where, I freelance 1 day a week, but then I also have a regular role that is a contractor freelance role, but I've got regular working hours in a supportive environment in a disabled people's organization where most, if not all of us are disabled. We all get it. We all have low spoon days and we just understand each other. So those working environments exist, and it might take a while to find a working environment like that, but you will. So that's what I would say to fellow ADHDers. People work with us, people who live with us, people who know and hopefully love us. We go off on tangents sometimes. I've been deliberately trying to not go off on tangents because I am quite conscious of time. But one of my favorite things about talking with other neurodivergent people is just that the conversation is alive. We might go into a conversation or a meeting with an agenda, but then we'll come out with all of these ideas and all of these kind of thoughts about how to implement changes, how to improve things. And I think that's really wonderful. Just embrace that. And again, going back to, I think something that both Adam and Dan were talking about, quite often we will spot issues. We might spot inconsistencies. We might seek clarity. And it's the kind of canary in the mine situation, right? Try not to see us as obstacles or as a problem. We're trying to help, even if it doesn't feel that way. Where ultimately we're trying to create a working environment that we can thrive in and that everybody can thrive in. An environment with clear expectations of people, an environment with clear processes that make sense. I guess just talk to us like we're just people, just like you. We're not superheroes. We're not kind of charity cases. We're just people who communicate differently, who work differently. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lex. Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Daniel, Adam, Lex. This has been a really great conversation. It's the important thing about these podcasts and conversations like this is the experience of these three. It doesn't mean that it's the experience of everyone. So it's a taster, right? And this is the journey that Lex, Adam, and Daniel have been on. So I'd encourage you all to do your research, to listen to the podcast. They've had lots of recommendations for organizations and LinkedIn profile and people to go check out. But do that extra work and have in mind the full access of everyone when we're engaging with the other humans that we work with. Thanks so much, Justin. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. Please do spread the word about our channel and tune in for our next episode.